They say a Category 5 storm takes everything, but my son took more from me than the wind ever could. He left me at a gas station, with nothing but the clothes on my back, while he drove away in the car I helped pay for. 24 hours later, millions of people saw my face on the news, and the world finally saw him for what he truly was. I survived the hurricane, but he will not survive the storm I am bringing home. My name is Eleanor Braddock, but most people in Port Liddell simply know me as Ellie. I am 58 years old, a widow who has weathered enough seasons on this coast to recognize when the air turns dangerous. This time, however, the danger was not just in the sky. It was sitting right next to me in the driver's seat. The evacuation order had turned our small town into a scene from a nightmare. Sirens screamed relentlessly, a mechanical wail that drowned out the rising wind. The humidity was suffocating, thick enough to taste, and the sky had curdled into a bruised purple that promised violence. My right knee was throbbing, a sharp and grinding pain that always signaled a drop in barometric pressure. I tried to shift my leg for relief, but there was nowhere to move. My son, Nathan Braddock, had packed his SUV until the rear window was completely blocked. There were boxes, duffel bags, and plastic bins stacked so high that I felt less like a passenger and more like an afterthought squeezed between a cooler and the door. It seemed like too much luggage for a temporary evacuation, but I did not want to nag him. He was already so tense. Nathan gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his eyes fixed on the bumper of the car ahead of us. Every few minutes, his phone would light up. He would answer in a low, clipped voice, saying things I could not quite catch, before hanging up abruptly. When I asked him who it was, he just shook his head and told me to relax. But he was sweating, despite the air conditioning blasting against his face. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold stone settling in my stomach, but I pushed it down. This was my son. He was the boy who used to sleep on the floor by my bed during thunderstorms. He would never let anything happen to me. We had been crawling in traffic for 2 hours when Nathan suddenly swerved toward the exit for a rest stop. The wind was picking up, whipping trash and dry leaves across the asphalt. "I need to check the back tires," Nathan said, his voice tight. "And the traffic is not moving. You should go use the restroom while we are stopped. It might be hours before we stop again." It sounded reasonable. I unbuckled my seatbelt and winced as I put weight on my bad knee. "Leave your purse, Mum," he said as I reached for it. "You do not need to lug it all the way there. It is safer here." I nodded, trusting him, and stepped out into the swirling wind. The air smelled of exhaust and imminent rain. I began the slow, painful walk toward the brick building, navigating through crowds of frightened families and barking dogs. I was halfway to the entrance when I heard the engine rev. It was a loud, aggressive roar that made me turn around. I saw the SUV backing out, not carefully, but with a violent speed that made the tires screech. He was not parking. He was leaving. I watched, paralyzed, as he cut off a pickup truck and merged aggressively back onto the highway. I stood there on the cracked pavement, the wind whipping my grey hair across my face, waiting for him to turn around. I told myself he was just maneuvering. I told myself he would come back. But 10 minutes passed, and the brake lights of his car had long since vanished into the river of traffic. I reached for my pocket out of habit, needing to call him, needing to ask why he was taking so long. Then my hand hit empty fabric. My phone was in the car. My wallet, with every dollar I owned and my identification, was in the car. My medication was in the car. I stood alone in a sea of strangers, 50 miles from a home that was about to be destroyed, realizing with a horror colder than the storm that my son had not just driven away. He had discarded me. The world around me dissolved into absolute noise. The sirens were no longer distant warnings, but were right on top of me, screaming from ambulances and police cruisers that were pushing aggressively against the flow of traffic to get to the coast. I tried to stumble back toward the gas station entrance, my bad knee buckling under the force of the gusts. But the automatic doors were frozen shut. Inside, the fluorescent lights had died. A handwritten sign was taped to the glass, flapping violently against the pane, reading simply, "Closed. No power." I turned around, looking for a friendly face, looking for anyone who might lend me a phone. But people were not looking at each other anymore. They were staring at the horizon with terror in their eyes. Suddenly, a metal billboard advertising cheap insurance groaned overhead. I barely had time to cover my head before the steel supports snapped. The massive sign crashed into the asphalt just 10 feet away from me, sending up a spray of sparks as metal ground against stone. The sound was like a gunshot, and it shattered whatever composure I had left. I stumbled toward a line of people trying to board a yellow school bus that had been repurposed for evacuation, desperation clawing at my throat. I grabbed the arm of a young man in a safety vest who was checking people at the door. I tried to tell him my son had left me and that I needed a ride, but the words came out as a frantic sob. He looked me up and down. I caught my reflection in the bus window and realized what he saw. My hair was wild from the wind, my clothes were disheveled, and my hands were empty. I looked crazy. I looked like someone who had nowhere to go long before the storm started. "Ticket or ID? Ma'am!" he shouted over the rising wind. I told him I did not have it. I explained that it was in the car and my son drove away with my purse. The young man's face hardened. He pulled his arm away, his expression shifting from concern to annoyance. "We cannot take undocumented passengers right now. Priority boarding for verified residents. Step back." "Ma'am?" He thought I was a vagrant. He thought I was looking for a free ride out of a life that had gone wrong. Not a woman who had spent 30 years paying property taxes and raising a child in this very county. The shame was hotter than the humid air. It burned my cheeks. I opened my mouth to scream that I was Eleanor Braddock, that I mattered. But the wind snatched the words right out of my mouth and scattered them into the dark. I was pushed back by the crowd, stumbling toward the edge of the parking lot where the drainage ditch was already overflowing. The rain began then, not as drops, but as hard, horizontal sheets that felt like gravel hitting my skin. I was going to die here. I was going to die alone in a parking lot because my son wanted a future that did not include me. Just as my legs gave out, a hand clamped onto my wrist. It was a grip of iron, surprising and rough. "Get in here before you get killed, you damn fool." A voice cracked like a whip. I was yanked sideways, dragged, stumbling over wet grass and through a rusted metal door. The wind howled in protest before the heavy door was slammed shut and bolted, cutting the roar down to a dull throb. I collapsed onto a concrete floor, gasping for air, smelling gasoline, old fertilizer, and damp earth. A flashlight clicked on, blinding me for a second. Then the beam lowered, revealing a sturdy woman with short, greying hair and a face etched with lines of hard work. She was wearing a vest with a local volunteer patch that looked like it had seen better days. "You looked like a leaf about to blow into the next county," she said, offering me a rough hand to sit up. "I am Marlene Hook. 62 years old and too stubborn to leave. You look like you need water more than you need a prayer right now." The metal shed was a cacophony of terror. Every time a gust of wind slammed against the corrugated walls, the entire structure groaned and shuddered as if it were about to be ripped from its foundation. There were about 12 of us huddled inside, sitting on overturned buckets or resting against stacks of old tires. The floor was already slick with water that seeped in from under the door, mixing with the spilled motor oil and fertilizer to create a pungent, suffocating smell that made me nauseous. It was dark, lit only by the occasional flash of a flashlight or the terrifying strobes of lightning that cut through the cracks in the roof. Marlene sat beside me on a wooden crate, her presence steady and grounding in the chaos. She handed me a bottle of water she had fished from her tactical vest. As I drank, I felt her watching me, not with pity, but with a calculating curiosity. "You did not just wander off," she said, her voice low enough that the shivering family next to us could not hear. "I have seen panic, and I have seen accidents. You look like someone who was put out like the trash." I lowered the bottle, the plastic crinkling under my grip. The truth was lodged in my throat like a jagged stone. How could I say it aloud? How could I tell this stranger that the boy I had nursed through chickenpox, the man whose college tuition I had paid by working double shifts, had looked at me and decided I was baggage to be discarded? The shame was more painful than the arthritis in my knee. "We got separated," I lied, my voice trembling. "The traffic was bad. He is probably looking for me right now." Marlene did not call me a liar, but her eyes told me she knew. She leaned back against the rusted wall and sighed. "I survived Camille back in 1969, she said, staring at the vibrating ceiling. "I was 20 years old. We spent 6 hours on a roof while the ocean tried to scrub us off the face of the earth. I learned something that night. Storms have a way of stripping the paint off of everything. You see what houses are really made of, and you see what people are really made of." Her words settled over me, heavy and true. I wanted to ask her more, but a sudden wave of dizziness hit me. The world tilted alarmingly to the left. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm that I knew well. I had missed my morning dose of blood pressure medication, and the stress was sending my levels into the danger zone. I slumped against Marlene, gasping for air. "Ellie." Marlene's voice sounded far away. A moment later, a beam of light hit my face. A rescue worker in a yellow slicker, soaked to the bone, knelt beside us. He was shouting over the roar of the wind, asking for my name, my history. "I need her ID," he barked at Marlene. "We need to process her if she is going to be transported. Does she have any medical alerts?" I left it." I stammered, trying to sit up, but my head was swimming. "My son has my purse. My pills are in the car." The worker's expression shifted from urgent to dismissive. He looked at Marlene and tapped the side of his head. "Is she all there?" "We have got 3 dementia cases already tonight. Old folks wandering out of their houses thinking it is a sunny day. If she is confused, she goes in the yellow group." The word struck me like a physical blow. Confused. Dementia. He was looking at me and seeing a senile old woman, a burden that no one claimed. He was stripping away my agency just as Nathan had stripped away my safety. I wanted to scream that I was a bookkeeper, that I managed my own accounts, that I was sane, but the lack of blood flow to my brain made my words slur. "She is not confused," Marlene snapped, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She placed a protective hand on my shoulder. She is in hypertensive crisis because she has been through hell. She knows exactly who she is, and she is with me. The worker held up his hands in surrender and moved on to the next person. Marlene turned to me, her face close to mine. "Listen to me," she commanded. "My group is moving out. We are taking a transport truck to a high school gymnasium about 10 miles inland. It is going to be rough, but I am not leaving you here to be tagged like lost luggage. Can you walk if I help you?" I looked at this woman, a stranger who had shown me more loyalty in 2 hours than my own flesh and blood had in years. I nodded, tears mixing with the grime on my face. "Yes," I whispered. "I can walk." The high school gymnasium smelled of bleach, wet wool, and the collective anxiety of 300 strangers. I sat on a green canvas cot that was too low to the ground for my bad knee, staring at the plastic wristband a volunteer had snapped onto my arm. It did not have my name on it. It just had a number. Without my driver's license or my social security card, I was officially unverified. I was just another grey-haired woman occupying space in the system, waiting for a family member to claim me. But nobody was coming to claim me. Marlene sat on the floor beside me, her back resting against the bleachers. She had managed to charge her phone at a chaotic power strip near the entrance and thrust the device into my hands. "Think, Ellie," she urged, her voice rough but steady. "There has to be someone else. A cousin, a neighbor. Someone who is not the son who left you at a gas station." My mind felt like a heavy, waterlogged sponge. I tried to recall the landline number of Clara, a friend I had not seen in 5 years who moved to Alabama. My fingers shook as I punched in the digits. I held the phone to my ear, praying for a ringtone. But all I got was a sharp, 3-tone beep and a mechanical voice telling me the number was no longer in service. I lowered the phone, feeling the silence of the room press in on me despite the noise of crying babies and shouting volunteers. "He did not just forget you," Marlene said. It was not a question. She was looking at me with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through my denial. I watched the traffic flow. "Ellie?" It was slow, but it was moving. If he had panicked and driven off, he could have looped back at the next exit. That was 6 hours ago. I wanted to defend him. The instinct to protect my child was woven into my DNA, deeper than my survival instinct. "He has been under a lot of stress," I whispered, picking at a loose thread on the blanket. "He has been so different lately. Edgy, secretive. He stops talking when I walk into the room." Marlene leaned in closer. "Different how?" "About 2 months ago. He came over for dinner?" I said, the memory surfacing through the fog of shock. "He was in such a rush. He put a stack of papers in front of me while I was clearing the table. He said the insurance company required a signature to update our policy for storm coverage. He said the rates were going up, and if I did not sign right then, we would lose protection." "Did you read them?" Marlene asked. "I tried," I admitted, feeling a fresh wave of nausea. But I did not have my reading glasses, and he was tapping his foot, checking his watch, telling me I was being difficult. He said, "Mum, do you trust me or not?" So I signed. A volunteer nurse who was changing the bandage on my knee paused. She had been listening while she worked, her face grim. She looked up at Marlene, then at me. "Ma'am, I am from Florida," she said quietly. I spent 2 seasons working the shelters after the big hurricanes down there. You would not believe how many seniors get dropped off at shelters just like this one while their kids go claim the insurance checks for total loss. If you are not in the house, you are not a liability to their claim. If you go missing during a disaster, the payout process is faster. The blood drained from my face. The nurse's words connected the dots I had been refusing to see. The crowded car, the refusal to let me bring my purse, the stop at the gas station, the signature on a document I had never read. It was not panic. It was a plan. My son had not just abandoned me. He had erased me. He had calculated my value and decided I was worth more as a tragedy than as a mother. "He thinks you are gone," Marlene said, her voice hard as flint. "He thinks you are a statistic now, a poor old lady who got confused and wandered into the storm." I looked around the gym, at the families holding each other, and then I looked at my empty hands. I had nothing. No home, no money, no identity. But I had my voice, and I had the truth. "He is going to get away with it," I said, my voice trembling with a rage that was finally overtaking the grief. "He has my phone. He has the narrative." Marlene held up her smartphone again. The screen glowed in the dim light. She opened the camera app and flipped it to video mode. "Not if you speak first," she said. "The news crews are stuck on the highway, but the internet is still working. You tell them. Ellie, you tell the world exactly what Nathan Braddock did to you." I wiped the dirt from my cheek and looked into the small black lens. I straightened my spine, ignoring the pain in my knee. "Record it," I told her. "Record it all." Marlene posted the video on her personal page with a simple caption: "This is what was left behind at exit 42. At first, it felt like shouting into a void. The internet was flooded with videos of palm trees snapping in half and storm surges swallowing piers. For the first 20 minutes, we sat in the humidity of the gymnasium, watching the view counter tick up slowly. 10 views. 25 views. I felt a heavy stone of disappointment settle in my stomach. I thought that perhaps the world was too busy with the hurricane to care about one old woman sitting on a cot. Then, everything changed in the blink of an eye. A volunteer group known as the Coastal Search and Rescue Network, which had over 2 million followers, shared Marlene's post. They added a caption that read, "Do you recognize her? Abandoned without ID or food during a mandatory evacuation. Let's find her family." The phone in Marlene's hand began to buzz. It buzzed once, then again, and within 60 seconds, it was vibrating so constantly that it looked like a living thing trying to escape her grip. The view count jumped from a few dozen to 5,000, then 50,000, and then, terrifyingly, to 500,000. My face, streaked with mud and tears, my silver hair whipped wild by the wind, was suddenly on screens across the country. Marlene scrolled through the comments, her eyes wide. People were angry. They were not just upset. They were furious. The hashtag #StormMomAbandoned began to trend, climbing the charts faster than the storm surge itself. Strangers from Ohio and Oregon were comparing my situation to a notorious case of elder abandonment in Florida from 3 years ago, demanding to know who was responsible. The comments section was a sea of fire and pitchforks. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the shelter shifted. A woman in a FEMA vest, accompanied by a police officer, hurried over to our corner. They were no longer looking at me as a nuisance or a dementia case. They were looking at me like I was a fragile piece of evidence. The officer knelt his voice gentle but serious, and asked if I was indeed Eleanor Braddock. When I nodded, he spoke into his radio, confirming they had located the subject of the viral video. I learned later that Nathan saw it while sitting in a motel room 3 hours north, safe and dry. I can only imagine the colour draining from his face when he opened his social media feed and saw his mother, the woman he thought had vanished into the storm, staring back at him with haunting clarity. Marlene told me later that her messenger inbox lit up with a frantic call from a user named Nathan Braddock. He called once, twice, 5 times in a row. He was trying to reach me, perhaps to beg, perhaps to threaten, but he could not get through. He had stolen my phone, and in doing so, he had cut the only line of communication he had to silence me. He was screaming into a disconnected void of his own making. An hour later, a local news crew that had been sheltering nearby managed to get into the gymnasium. A young reporter with wet hair and a microphone spotted me. She did not need to ask who I was. My face was already burned into the news cycle. She crouched beside my cot, the camera light blindingly bright. "Mrs. Braddock?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "The whole country is asking. How did you end up at that gas station?" I looked directly into the lens. I thought of Nathan's hand gripping the steering wheel. I thought of the insurance papers he made me sign without reading. I thought of the cold wind on my face as his taillights faded. I did not stutter. I did not cry. "My son told me to get out to use the restroom," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to be heard over the shelter noise. "He told me he would wait, but when I came out, he was gone. He took my ID. He took my money. And he took the only car we had. He did not lose me in the storm. He left me to it." The storm outside had passed, but the hurricane destroying my son's life was just making landfall. By the time the sun rose over the evacuation center, my story was no longer just a viral video. It was a national conversation. People from Seattle to Miami were debating the morality of what had happened to me, and the verdict was unanimous. Nathan tried to get ahead of it. I learned later that he had called his college friends and neighbors, spinning a frantic tale about a chaotic mix-up on the highway, claiming the police had refused to let him turn back. He tried to play the victim of circumstance, but the timeline did not add up, and for the first time in his life, his charm was not enough to cover the rot underneath. The first real blow came from a man named Greg, a fishing buddy Nathan had known for 10 years. Greg did not buy the sob story. Instead, he went to a local news station with his cell phone and played a voice message Nathan had left him 3 weeks prior. I sat in the shelter's cafeteria, clutching a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee, and listened to my son's voice broadcast on the television mounted on the wall. His voice sounded slurred and angry. He said, "I am drowning here. Man. She is a financial anchor around my neck. If she was not in the picture, I would be walking away with 6 figures. Sometimes I wish a disaster would just wipe the slate clean." The cafeteria went silent. The strangers around me looked at me with a mixture of horror and pity, but I could not look away. That voicemail opened the floodgates. By noon, an insurance broker from a neighboring county had contacted the police. He reported that a man matching Nathan's description had called his office 2 days before the evacuation order. He had not asked about protecting the house. He had asked specifically about the payout timeline for a policyholder deemed missing in a natural disaster. He wanted to know if the money would be released immediately or if there was a waiting period for a death certificate. It was not a panic reaction. It was a premeditated calculation. Nathan had been checking the price tag on my life while I was cooking him dinner, but the hardest hit was yet to come. A detective from the county sheriff's office sat down across from me at a metal folding table. He slid a folder toward me. Inside were documents related to my home, the small cottage I had paid off 5 years ago. Or so I thought. The papers showed a second mortgage taken out 6 months ago, cashing out $80,000 of equity. The signature at the bottom was Eleanor Braddock, but the loop on the B was too wide. It was a forgery. He had stolen my home out from under me long before he left me at that gas station. I felt the room spin. I had thought he was just selfish, perhaps scared. I did not want to believe he was a criminal. Marlene sat beside me, her hand resting heavily on my shoulder. She leaned in, her voice low and devoid of the softness she had shown earlier. "Ellie, look at me. He did not leave you because there was no room in the car. He left you because you were the only witness to what he had done. If you do not fight back now, you are letting him finish the job." Her words cut through the fog of my motherly denial. I looked at the detective, then at the camera crew waiting outside the glass doors. I realized that protecting Nathan now would be a sin against the woman I used to be, the woman who had worked 2 jobs to buy that house. I took a deep breath, swallowing the lump of betrayal in my throat. "I want to file charges," I told the detective, my voice sounding stronger than I felt. "I want to tell you everything." That evening, the local district attorney announced they were opening a formal investigation into Nathan Braddock for financial fraud and reckless endangerment. My son was no longer just a bad child. He was a suspect, and I was the star witness who had survived the storm he hoped would bury me. The lights in the gymnasium had been dimmed for the night, turning the massive room into a cavern of shadows and echoing coughs. I lay on my cot, staring up at the steel rafters, unable to close my eyes. The adrenaline of the survival had faded, leaving behind a hollow, aching silence where my heart used to be. My mind drifted back to the Gulf Coast of my youth, to the smell of salt spray and blooming jasmine, and to the man who had stood beside me through the first half of my life. My husband had been a strong man, the kind who boarded up windows with calm precision while I paced the hallway. When he died, 15 years ago, I thought the worst part of my life was over. I thought I had paid my dues to grief. I closed my eyes and saw Nathan as a boy. He was not the man with the cold eyes who drove away in an SUV. He was 7 years old, wearing oversized pajamas, clutching a worn-out teddy bear as thunder shook our old bungalow. He used to crawl into my bed during storms, burying his face in my shoulder, whispering that he was scared. I would stroke his hair and promise him that as long as I was there, nothing could hurt him. I had spent his entire life being his shield. I had protected him from bullies, from bad grades, and from the consequences of his own mistakes. I tried to pinpoint the moment the boy who needed me became the man who discarded me. It was not sudden. It was a slow erosion, like a coastline eaten away by the tide. It started 5 years ago with the gambling. First it was just sports, then online poker, then debts that he swore were just misunderstandings. I remembered the first time I bailed him out. He had cried at my kitchen table, promising he would never do it again. I wrote the check. I always wrote the check. I told myself I was being a good mother. I told myself I was helping him get back on his feet. Now, lying on a FEMA cot, the guilt washed over me, colder than the rain. Had I done this? Had I loved him so much, softened the world for him so often? that he began to see me not as a person, but as a resource. I had taught him that his problems were my problems. I had taught him that my safety was secondary to his comfort. I had created a monster by feeding it love, and now that monster had turned around and tried to devour me. The thought of the detective waiting for my formal statement in the morning made my stomach turn. To cooperate meant to condemn him. To tell the truth about the insurance fraud and the mortgage meant sending my only child to prison. Every instinct in my body rebelled against it. Biology screamed at me to protect him, to lie, to say it was an accident, to say I had just wandered off. I could go back to being the silent victim. I could save him one last time. I felt a hand on my arm. Marlene was awake, watching me from the next cot. She did not ask what I was thinking. She knew. She had seen the look on my face, the wavering resolve. "You are thinking about fixing it for him," Marlene whispered. It was not a question. "You are thinking that if you just keep your mouth shut, he might come back and say sorry." "He is my son," I whispered back, the tears finally spilling over and running into my ears. "He is all I have left." Marlene sat up and looked me hard in the eyes. The shadows made her face look severe, like a judge carved from granite. "He is not your son anymore, Ellie. He is a man who looked at a storm that could kill you and decided it was a convenient way to cash a check. You need to hear this, and you need to hear it clearly. Protecting him today means killing yourself tomorrow. If you let him get away with this, he will not stop. Next time, there won't be a gas station. Next time, he will make sure you do not come back." Her words were brutal, but they rang with the clarity of a church bell. I thought of the empty space in the car. I thought of the forgery on my deed. I realized she was right. The boy who held my hand during thunder was dead. The man who remained was a stranger who had calculated the price of my death. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The tears stopped. A cold resolve settled in my chest, replacing the motherly warmth that had almost drowned me. I would not be his victim. I would not be his paycheck. "I know," I said, my voice steady in the darkness. "I am ready. Tomorrow. I tell them everything." By the time the sun rose on the second day, the story had outgrown the internet and taken over the airwaves. I woke up to find that the high school parking lot was no longer a place for refugees, but a staging ground for satellite trucks. Every major news network from New York to Atlanta had sent a crew to Port Liddell. They were all looking for the storm mom, the woman whose face had become the symbol of the hurricane's human toll. The shelter director came to my cot with a worried look and told me that for the safety of the other evacuees, I could not stay there. The crowd of reporters outside was becoming a mob, desperate for a soundbite. 2 police officers escorted me out through the kitchen loading dock. I sat in the back of a cruiser with tinted windows, watching the frenzy through the glass. It was surreal. I was a 58-year-old bookkeeper who enjoyed knitting and quiet evenings. And now I was being moved like a witness in a mafia trial. They took me to a secure motel room that the city had commandeered for emergency personnel. Marlene insisted on coming with me, and the officers, recognizing her as my lifeline, did not argue. We sat on the edge of the motel bed and watched the television as the local district attorney stood on the steps of the courthouse. He looked angry. He stared into the microphones and announced that his office was officially opening a criminal investigation into Nathan Braddock. The charge was abandonment of a vulnerable adult in a dangerous situation, coupled with an investigation into potential financial fraud. Hearing those words spoken aloud on national television made my breath hitch. It was real. My son was being hunted by the law. The news coverage shifted to the street where I used to live. A reporter was standing on the sidewalk in front of Nathan's house. The storm shutters were still up, but the atmosphere was hostile. Neighbors who had known Nathan since he was in diapers were interviewed. One woman, Mrs. Gable, who used to bake him cookies, crossed her arms and told the camera that she had seen him loading his car and he looked like a man running from a crime, not a storm. She said the whole neighborhood had turned their backs on him. Even his own cousins had posted online that they wanted nothing to do with him. Nathan tried to stop the bleeding. We learned later that he walked into the police station voluntarily that afternoon, thinking he could charm his way out of it, just like he used to charm his way out of detention in high school. He sat in the interrogation room and tried to spin a web of lies. He told the detectives that he had panicked, that the police had set up a roadblock preventing him from turning back, and that his phone had died. But he was sloppy. He contradicted himself within minutes, claiming first that he waited for an hour and then claiming he left immediately because of a safety order. The police did not need his confession because they had facts. A long-haul truck driver who had been parked at the same gas station came forward. He gave a statement saying he saw the SUV peel out of the lot less than 2 minutes after I walked toward the restroom. He said the driver did not look hesitant or confused. He looked like he was fleeing. Then came the final nail in the coffin. The Department of Transportation released traffic camera footage. It showed Nathan's SUV merging onto the northbound highway 10 minutes after he left me. He was not driving back toward the exit to look for me. He was driving away at 80 miles per hour, putting as much distance between himself and his mother as possible. The footage was played on the evening news, a grainy loop of betrayal broadcast to millions. There was no misunderstanding. There was only cold, hard proof. Everything was against him, and for the first time in his life, there was no one left to bail him out. The days following the storm brought a different kind of deluge, one that I was entirely unprepared to face. While the floodwaters receded from the streets of Port Liddell, a tidal wave of kindness crashed over me, washing away the grime of the evacuation center. I had spent my life believing that charity was something you gave, not something you received. But the world insisted on proving me wrong. An online fundraiser established by a stranger in Ohio raised over $75,000 in just 3 days. People I had never met, people who lived in states I had never visited, were sending $5 or $10 with notes saying that they saw their own mothers in my face. A national non-profit organization dedicated to protecting the elderly reached out to me. They did not just offer money, they offered me a platform. They asked if I would be the face of their new campaign to strengthen laws against elder abandonment during natural disasters. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in a long time, I felt useful. They pulled strings to expedite the bureaucratic nightmare I was facing. Within 48 hours, I had a temporary identification card, a new supply of my blood pressure medication, and a set of keys to a furnished efficiency apartment in a quiet complex 2 towns over. It was a compassionate housing grant, a place to rest my head while the lawyers fought for my real home. Marlene was the rock that anchored me through it all. She had originally planned to return to her mobile home in the next county, but after seeing the magnitude of the battle ahead of me, she changed her mind. She found a short-term rental just 4 blocks from my new apartment. "I am not going anywhere until you are standing on your own 2 feet again," she told me while we unpacked a box of donated clothes. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you actually eat dinner instead of just staring at the wall." She had become the family that blood had failed to provide. The most relief came in the form of a man named Sarah, a high-powered attorney who specialized in real estate fraud. She drove 3 hours to meet me, sitting on my second-hand sofa with a legal pad and a look of fierce determination. She told me that she was taking my case pro bono, which meant I would not have to pay a single cent. She reviewed the forged mortgage documents and the insurance policies Nathan had manipulated. "We are going to get your house back, Ellie," she promised me, her voice hard as steel. "And we are going to make sure the bank knows exactly who signed those papers." But the nights were still the hardest part. When the lawyers left and Marlene went home, I would sit with the tablet the organization had given me and read the messages flooding my inbox. There were thousands of them. At first, I thought they would just be well wishes, but they were confessions. Strangers poured their hearts out to me. A woman from Texas wrote about how her daughter had drained her savings account. A man from Oregon described being left in a nursing home against his will. I realized with a breaking heart that I was not an anomaly. My story was just the one that happened to get caught on camera. I had become a vessel for the pain of millions of parents who had been discarded by the very children they raised. I replied to as many as I could, telling them to be brave, telling them they mattered. Yet, when I put the screen away and turned off the lamp, the silence of the room was deafening. I would lie there and think of Nathan. I thought of the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. I thought of the teenager who promised to buy me a mansion one day. The public wanted me to hate him. The law wanted to punish him. But I was his mother. The anger was there, burning hot and bright. But underneath it was a terrible, aching grief. I asked myself the question that haunted me every hour of every day. Could I ever forgive him? The world called him a monster, but I still remembered him as my son, and that was a torture no court could solve. The final hearing took place 6 weeks after the storm had passed, once the floodwaters had receded and the city began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. The courthouse air conditioning was humming loudly, fighting the lingering humidity, but the room felt cold. When Nathan walked in, I almost did not recognize him. He was gaunt, his skin sallow, and his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. There was no entourage of friends, no girlfriend, and no family to support him. He sat alone at the defense table with a court-appointed attorney, looking small and terrified. I sat in the front row, flanked by Marlene and Sarah, my lawyer. My hands were trembling in my lap, but I forced myself to look at him. I needed him to see me. I needed him to see that I was not a ghost or a statistic. I was his mother, and I was still here. When Nathan took the stand, he tried to explain away his cruelty. He spoke about his gambling debts, which had spiraled into the tens of thousands. He talked about the panic that had gripped him when the evacuation order came down. "I did not mean for it to happen like that," he stammered, refusing to meet my eyes. I was stressed. I thought she would be safe at the station. I just needed time to figure things out. I was going to come back. His words might have swayed a softer judge, but the prosecutor was ready. He projected an image onto the screen that silenced the room. It was a screenshot of a text message Nathan had sent to a bookie named Jace just 10 minutes before he dropped me off. The message read, "If the surge hits hard enough, all my problems float away. Insurance covers the total loss. Let nature do the dirty work." A collective gasp went through the gallery. There it was, the smoking gun. He had not panicked. He had hoped the Atlantic Ocean would murder his mother so he could cash a check. Nathan put his head in his hands, shrinking under the weight of his own malice. The judge declared him guilty of abandoning a vulnerable adult in a hazardous situation and guilty of financial fraud. Before the sentencing, the judge asked if I wanted to speak. I stood up, my bad knee aching, but my voice did not waver. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at the back of my son's head, "I do not want my son to rot in a prison cell. Prison will not teach him how to care. But I want him to understand that I am a human being, not a line item on a spreadsheet. I want to live the rest of my life without fear. And I want him to remember every single day what he threw away." The judge nodded slowly. The sentence was not prison time, which Nathan likely expected. It was 3 years of mandatory rehabilitation for his gambling addiction, 5 years of strict probation, and full restitution of the assets he had stolen from me. But the part that felt like true justice was the community service requirement. Nathan was ordered to complete 2,000 hours of service at a state-run nursing home, caring for the very demographic he had tried to discard. He would have to look into the faces of the elderly every day and see his mother staring back at him. Nathan lost his job. He lost his reputation in town. He was forced to move into a halfway house to begin his treatment. As he was led away in handcuffs to be processed, he finally looked back at me. His eyes were filled with tears. But I did not run to comfort him. I just nodded. A silent acknowledgement that this was a path he had paved for himself. 2 months later, I stood on the porch of my cottage. The roof had been patched, and the walls were freshly painted a soft yellow, thanks to a volunteer crew led by Marlene. The air smelled of salt and wet earth, clean and new. I was not the same woman who had climbed into that SUV. I was scarred. Yes, but I was solid. I had reclaimed my home, my identity, and my dignity. I had not forgiven Nathan yet. Forgiveness is a long road, and I was just taking the first steps. But as the sea breeze rattled the wind chimes on the porch, I realized the heavy, suffocating dread was gone. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of a life that was fully mine again. "I am back," I whispered to the ocean, "and the storm inside me is finally quiet." Thank you so much for listening to my story. It really means the world to me to share this journey with you. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can all say hello to each other. If this story touched you, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video reach more people who might need to hear it.